And they did not die only by the gun and the knife. The killing was only one of what you might call the 4 horsemen of the Congo catastrophe. There was outright murder, yes, but there was also starvation, because when the men are forced into the forest to hunt rubber for months on end, no one is planting the crops, or fishing the rivers, or feeding the children, and famine follows. There was exhaustion. People quite literally worked to death, marched to death as porters carrying loads across the colony. And there was disease, smallpox, and devastatingly sleeping sickness, which swept through a population whose immune systems were broken by hunger and whose movements were forced and disrupted by the regime, spreading the sickness far and wide. And underneath all of it, a quieter catastrophe. The birth rate collapsed. When society is torn apart, when families are separated, when women are held hostage, and men are dying in the forest, children stop being born. A population doesn't just get murdered down, it fails to renew itself. That is how you lose a society, not in one massacre, but in 20 years of murder, hunger, sickness, and silence in the cradles. And while this was happening, while the Congo bled, let's follow the money, because the money is the whole point. Leopold grew rich beyond imagining. By the records we have, the rubber system generated something on the order of 70 million Belgian francs in profit for the king in roughly the decade between 1896 and 1905 alone, an astronomical sum for the time, as Congo rubber exports rocketed upward by hundreds of %. And where did that money go? It went home, to Belgium, and it was turned into stone and grandeur. This is the part that I think reveals the true obscenity of it. Leopold poured his blood-rubber fortune into monuments to himself and to his country. He funded grand public works, triumphal arches, palaces, parks, and seaside developments. He had a particular love for the resort town of Ostend and for grand architectural projects in and around Brussels. He built a great museum to house the spoils and the exhibits of his African empire. He commissioned arches and galleries and royal estates. He literally built monuments of triumph and beauty out of the proceeds of severed hands. The people of Belgium got handsome boulevards and imposing public buildings, much of it without ever being told or wanting to know what those gifts had cost in human lives. And the man who built it all never once traveled to the source of his wealth. He never saw a rubber vine or a force publique stockade or a single one of the hands in those baskets. To Leopold, the Congo was a number on a page and a rising line on a chart. The distance between the suffering and the spending, between a child's severed hand in a basket on the equator and a triumphal arch rising in a European capital, that distance is the whole moral catastrophe of colonialism in a single image. But the story does not end with Leopold getting away with it, because, and this is genuinely one of the more hopeful threads in a very dark tapestry, people found out. And the campaign to expose the Congo became one of the first great international human rights movements in history. It started with witnesses who refused to stay silent. An African-American journalist, historian, and minister named George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo in 1890, expecting to find Leopold's advertised paradise of uplift and civilization. Instead, he found atrocity, and he wrote a searing open letter to Leopold cataloging the abuses. And in doing so, he reached for a phrase to describe crimes of this magnitude that had no proper name yet. He accused the regime of crimes against humanity, one of the earliest uses of that now fundamental idea. Another African-American missionary, William Shepherd, documented the mutilations and the baskets of hands with his own eyes and his own pen. And in Britain, a shipping clerk named Edmund Dean Morell noticed something odd in the trade figures. Ships were returning from the Congo, loaded with valuable rubber and ivory, but sailing out to the Congo carrying mostly guns, chains, and ammunition. There was no real trade going in. Nothing was being paid for what came out. Morel realized, from columns of numbers in a shipping office, that he was looking at the statistical fingerprint of slavery and plunder. He gave up his career and devoted his life to exposing it, founding the Congo Reform Association in 1904. Then the British government sent its consul, an Irishman named Roger Casement, to investigate. Casement traveled the Congo, interviewing victims, recording names, dates, places, and specific atrocities, and in 1904 he produced an official report so detailed and so damning that it could not be dismissed as rumor. The Casement report, together with Morel's campaigning, blew the scandal open across the world. And crucially, this was the dawn of accessible photography, and missionaries, including a woman named Alice Seeley Harris, took photographs of the maimed survivors, of fathers staring at the severed hands of their own children. Those photographs were turned into lantern slide shows and shown to audiences across Britain and America. For perhaps the first time in history, people thousands of miles away could see an atrocity with their own eyes. The images were unbearable and they were undeniable. The greatest writers of the age took up the cause. Joseph Conrad, who had himself traveled up the Congo River, distilled the moral abyss of the place into his novel, Heart of Darkness. Mark Twain wrote a savage satirical pamphlet, King Leopold's Soliloquy, putting damning words of self-justification into the king's own mouth. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a furious book called The Crime of the Congo. The pressure became enormous, relentless, global. And in the end, it worked, at least partway. The scandal grew so toxic that it became untenable for Leopold to keep his private colony. In 1908, he was forced to give it up, not out of remorse, but because the alternative was worse for him. The Congo Free State was transferred to the Belgian government and became the Belgian Congo. But notice how it ended. Leopold did not stand trial. He was not punished. He was paid. The handover cost Belgium an enormous sum, over 200 million francs, to settle the colony's debts, and a large part of that went to Leopold himself, including a personal payment of around 50 million francs and tens of millions more for his beloved building projects. He was bought out of his crimes. And before he let go, he committed one last act that tells you he knew exactly what he had done. He had the archives of the Congo Free State burned. Furnaces ran for days, consuming the records of his regime. "They have no right to know what I did there," he is reported to have said. He tried to erase the evidence, to deny history its proof. Leopold died the following year, in 1909. At his funeral procession, the crowds reportedly booed. It was, perhaps, the only justice he ever faced, and it was nowhere near enough. But here is the thing I most need you to understand. The handover in 1908 did not free the Congo. It simply changed the owner. The Belgian Congo continued for another half-century as a colony run for the extraction of wealth, rubber, then copper, then uranium, then diamonds, built on forced labor and racial subjugation, gentler than Leopold's regime in its worst years, but never gentle. The colony did not end until 1960, when the Congo finally won independence. And the way that independence went tells you the story didn't really end at all. The Congo's first democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic nationalist who dared to denounce colonialism to the Belgians' faces, was in power for only months before he was overthrown, and in early 1961, assassinated, with the complicity of Belgian officials and Western intelligence, a fact Belgium has since formally acknowledged regretting. What followed was decades of dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko, who renamed the country Zaire and looted it on a colossal scale while the West propped him up. The colonial extraction machine simply handed to a homegrown kleptocrat. And now bring it all the way to the present, because this is where the past stops being history and becomes the device in your hand. The Democratic Republic of the Congo today is, by the cruel arithmetic of the world, one of the richest countries on earth in natural resources, and one of the poorest in the lives of its people. It sits on staggering reserves of copper, gold, diamonds, tin, and two minerals that run the modern world: coltan, which is refined into the tantalum in our phones and laptops, and cobalt, which is essential to the lithium-ion batteries in our smartphones, our laptops, and our electric cars. The DRC produces more than 60% of the world's cobalt, more than 60%. The thing that powers the green energy future, and the device you are very likely watching this on right now, comes, in large part, out of the same Congolese ground that Leopold bled for rubber. And how is it harvested? In large part in the so-called artisanal mines, by hand, in appalling and dangerous conditions, by some of the poorest people on earth, including, by widely cited estimates, around 40,000 children, some as young as 7 years old, digging cobalt out of tunnels and pits for a pittance, for a global supply chain that runs up into the most valuable companies in the world. The vines have become batteries, the rubber has become cobalt, the shikot and the stockade are gone, but the fundamental structure, the wealth of the Congo flowing out into the rich world while its people are ground down to extract it, has proven horribly durable. And layered on top of it is war. Eastern Congo has been torn for decades by conflict over land and minerals, the Second Congo War, and its aftermath killing an estimated 5 million people or more, mostly from disease and starvation, making it the deadliest conflict since the Second World War, and a tragedy the world has very largely ignored. So what about memory? What about justice? For most of the 20th century, Belgium chose not to remember. Leopold was commemorated as a builder king, his statues standing in public squares, his museum displaying African artifacts with little mention of how they were obtained, the horror politely forgotten. It took the work of historians like Adam Hochschild and the rise of a new generation unwilling to look away to drag the truth back into the light. In 2020, amid a global reckoning with racism and colonial history, protesters across Belgium attacked and defaced statues of Leopold, and authorities began quietly removing some of them. That same year, on the 60th anniversary of Congolese independence, Belgium's current king, Philippe, expressed his deepest regret for the violence and cruelty of the colonial past, and he repeated that regret on a visit to the Congo in 2022. But notice the careful wording. Regret, not an apology, and certainly not reparations. To this day, there has been no formal state apology for Leopold's regime, and no meaningful restitution to the country that was bled to build those boulevards. I started with a basket of hands, and I want to end by asking you to hold the people in it in your mind, not as a statistic, not as 10 million or 1 million or any number, because numbers that large stop meaning anything, which is exactly how atrocities get forgotten. Hold instead a single person, a man in a forest village coating his arms in rubber sap, knowing his wife is in a stockade and his quota is short. A mother, a 7-year-old whose hand was taken to balance a soldier's ledger. They had names, They had whole inner lives as vivid as yours. And they were spent, used up and thrown away, to build monuments and pad a fortune for a king who never saw their faces and ordered their records burned so that you and I would never know. But we do know. That's the small victory in all of this. The furnaces didn't quite work. The witnesses wrote it down. The missionaries took the photographs. The historians dug it back up. And as long as we keep saying it out loud, Leopold doesn't get the erasure he tried to buy. The least we can do, the very least, is refuse to forget, and to understand that the line running from his rubber to our cobalt is not broken yet, and that the Congo is still, right now, paying for the wealth the rest of the world enjoys. Thank you for sitting with me here in the quiet dark. If this story moved you, learn more, say their names, share it so others know. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.